The rain came down in a slow, steady curtain that blurred the world beyond the glass. Seattle's evening light bled into gray as Laya Hart pushed open the towering front door of the mansion. She had been told that no one would be home. The house was supposed to be empty, just another weekend job, another space filled with echoes of other people's lives. Yet something about this place felt alive in its silence. The air smelled faintly of cedar, and something else. Leather, perhaps, or the ghost of cigar smoke long since faded. Her shoes clicked against marble floors that reflected the storm outside. Each step she took left a soft print that vanished as quickly as her breath. The glass walls faced Lake Union, where the water moved like liquid metal beneath the sky. She paused near a grand piano draped in a thin film of dust. Someone had once loved this piano. She could almost feel it waiting. Leia began wiping the keys gently, careful not to make noise. She worked as she always did, quietly, focused, as if tidiness could protect her from loneliness. The steady hum of machines came from somewhere deeper in the house. Maybe a generator, maybe security systems. She told herself not to be nervous. Powerful men like their houses to feel like fortresses. A faint sound broke the stillness. She froze. It wasn't thunder. It was closer. Inside. She turned her head slightly, listening. Nothing. She laughed under her breath. "You're jumpy today, Laya," she whispered. Her voice seemed too loud in the vastness. She reached for a vase on the piano and adjusted it. Then she heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. A voice, a man's whisper, raspy from disuse. "Don't move." The words cut through the air like glass breaking underwater. Leia's hand stopped mid-motion. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. The candlelight reflection in the glass trembled. She looked toward the sound and saw him. A man sat in a wheelchair near the window, half hidden by shadow. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, longer than it should be, as if he'd stopped caring about such things. The lamplight carved lines across his face, deep, weathered, the kind that came not from age but from carrying weight no body was meant to hold. His hands rested still on the armrest, but his eyes looked alive, as if they had waited years for someone to notice they still existed. Leia didn't scream. Something in his tone told her not to. The command hadn't carried threat. It had carried pain. She stood there holding her breath, rain whispering against the glass. The man moved slightly, the soft creak of the wheelchair echoing through the room. "I thought you were gone," he murmured, voice trembling. "No one comes in without knocking." Leia swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I was told the house was empty. Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." The man turned his chair slightly toward her. Lightning flashed behind him, outlining his silhouette. "It's fine," he said after a moment, each word sounding like it cost effort. "I haven't seen anyone for days. I forgot what footsteps sound like." He looked at the piano, then back at her. "You play?" She shook her head. "No, Sal. I just clean." "Then why are your hands trembling?" he asked quietly. The question broke something small inside her she hadn't realized they were. "I guess because I didn't expect anyone to speak," she admitted. His lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Neither did I." Silence stretched again, but now it wasn't empty. It was full of awareness, of curiosity, of the faint pulse of two people suddenly aware of the other's loneliness. Leia stepped back slowly. "I should finish the hallway, sir." "What's your name?" "Leia." "Leia," he repeated softly, tasting the word as if remembering language itself. "It's been a long time since I said anyone's name." She didn't know how to respond. She only nodded, her eyes meeting his reflection in the window instead of his face. Rain streaked down the glass, blending their outlines together. His motionless form and her hesitant shadow. "Do you want me to close the blinds?" she asked finally. "No," he said. "Leave them open. I like the rain." She nodded again, unsure why her chest felt tight. The air between them shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something quieter, deeper, a shared silence that somehow felt like recognition. She turned to leave the room, but his voice stopped her once more. "Leia," he said, softer now. "Thank you for not moving." She glanced back. His gaze had drifted toward the window again, as if he were speaking to the rain itself. For a moment, she thought he might vanish into that reflection, just another ghost behind the glass. Outside, the storm deepened, thunder rolling across the lake. Inside, the mansion that had slept for years had just taken its first breath. Dante Moretti sat by the window long after the maid had gone, watching the reflection of rain slide down the glass like tears he could not shed. The city beyond looked unreal, a blur of light and motion, separated from him by walls that were both glass and habit. He used to love this view. He had built this house himself, or rather, he designed it to be everything he believed power should look like. Transparent, commanding, untouchable. Now the transparency felt like exposure. The house showed his life for what it was, an empire of silence. 3 years earlier, he had been at the height of his influence. The Moretti name carried weight in rooms where decisions were made in whispers, where territories were divided over handshakes and threats were delivered with smiles. He had controlled import routes, protection networks, real estate that stretched from Seattle to Vancouver. He wasn't called a genius or a savior. He was called something more fundamental, respected, feared, necessary. Then came the storm over Oregon, the private jet, the crash. He survived. His oldest friend, his partner since they were boys running packages for their fathers, did not. The irony was cruel. The man who had protected hundreds, who had made his fortune ensuring safety for those who paid, couldn't protect the one person who mattered most, couldn't even protect himself. For a year, he tried to recover, believing he could rebuild himself with the same force that had built his operations. But power is not physical therapy. Influence doesn't heal spinal cord damage. And when your voice disappears, not from injury, but from the weight of having nothing left worth saying, doctors give it names like psychogenic mutism, as if labels made the silence easier to bear. But Dante knew better. It wasn't his voice that was broken. It was purpose. Every word he could think of felt useless because there was no one he wanted to say it to. His wife left within months, unable to live inside the endless quiet, unable to accept that the man she'd married for his strength now embodied only its absence. The families, the council, the network he'd helped build replaced him quietly, efficiently, the way you remove a piece from a board game that no longer serves its function. They sent flowers. They sent checks. They didn't send visitors. He communicated through screens after that. The household staff received instructions by email. The gardener got daily notes on a tablet. When he needed anything, he ordered it online. Technology made life easier, but it also allowed him to disappear completely without anyone noticing. The irony was not lost on him. He had built an empire on being seen, on commanding rooms with nothing but his presence. Now those same tools of control kept him invisible. The night the maid arrived, he had been sitting in darkness, tracing raindrops with his eyes, not expecting anything to change. He had seen her before on the cameras, moving carefully through the halls, respectful of every object she touched. She never looked into the lenses. She treated the mansion not like a workplace, but like a sacred space, and something about that reverence disturbed him. That day, when she entered the music room, her figure reflected in the polished piano. Something in the way she moved reminded him of a life he'd forgotten. Deliberate, gentle, alive. When she reached to adjust the vase, a flash of lightning illuminated her hands, and for a second, the silence around him cracked. Words came out before he could stop them. "Don't move." The sound startled him as much as it did her. His voice was hoarse, deep, unused. It felt foreign, like something borrowed from another man, from the Dante who used to give orders that shaped the movement of entire cities. When she turned, eyes wide and uncertain, he realized how strange he must have looked. Pale, unshaven, diminished. A ghost sitting in a chair that might as well have been a throne of glass. But she didn't run. That, more than anything, stayed with him. Now, in the aftermath, he replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The words, the look on her face, the way the rain dimmed the light around her. For 3 years, he had spoken to no one. He thought silence had become a companion he could live with. But a single whisper had shattered that fragile peace. He wheeled himself closer to the piano, his fingers brushing against the cold ivory keys. He hadn't played since before the crash. Music once came as easily as breathing. Now even pressing a note felt like opening a wound. He let his hands rest there, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingertips. Somewhere deep in Sweden, he felt the echo of a melody he used to know. He wondered who the maid was beyond the uniform. Her voice had been calm, not frightened. That steadiness lingered. He had heard pity in many voices before, but not in hers. Hers had carried warmth, or, yeah, maybe, professional, almost clinical, the way nurses speak when they've seen too much suffering to be shocked by it anymore. The way she looked at him reminded him of the physical therapist from his rehabilitation days, except she didn't speak to fill the air. She let silence breathe. Maybe that was why he had spoken to her. In a world of people who either talked too much or avoided him entirely, she had simply existed in the quiet with him. He tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. Every time thunder rolled over the lake, he saw her standing by the piano, frozen between obedience and curiosity. He imagined her thinking that he was cruel, or perhaps insane, yet a strange calm had followed after she left. The house no longer felt empty. It felt aware. Morning light spilled across the marble floor, softer than it had any right to be. The rain had stopped. Dante looked at his reflection in the glass wall. The man who looked back seemed unfamiliar. His beard had grown uneven, his shoulders had begun to hunch forward. He looked less like someone who once commanded respect and more like a relic of that man. He wheeled himself to his desk, opened his laptop, and typed a message to his household manager. Cancel the other staff for the week, the maid stays. His finger hovered above the send button. For a moment he hesitated. Why her? He couldn't explain it. Something about her quiet presence had disturbed the stillness he'd mistaken for peace. It was terrifying and yet necessary. He pressed send. Later that afternoon when she returned, he didn't speak. He watched from the corner of the room as she moved through the halls. She didn't glance toward him or the cameras. She just worked, humming softly. A melody that was unfamiliar. Maybe a lullaby. Maybe something older. He closed his eyes and listened. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't hurt. The next few days passed like a gentle ripple through still water. The house, once known only for its echoes, began to carry traces of life. A teacup slightly out of place. The faint hum of a melody drifting between rooms. The quiet rhythm of footsteps that belonged to someone other than him. Leah Hart arrived each morning with the same calm expression. She wore simple clothes, hair tied back neatly, her eyes never resting anywhere longer than needed. She didn't know who he was at first. The man in the wheelchair by the window might have been a guest, a caretaker, or perhaps the ghost of the mansion itself. Dante Moretti didn't correct her assumption. He let her move through the house like sunlight moves through curtains, soft, unaware of how much light it brings. She worked with quiet precision, cleaning each surface, watering the plants he hadn't noticed dying, dusting the corners of rooms that hadn't been entered for years. When she reached the piano, she paused again. "It's a beautiful instrument," she murmured, half to herself. "No one plays it," he answered, his voice low, uncertain. She froze, surprised by the sound of him speaking again. "It should be played," she said after a moment. "Otherwise, it forgets how to sing." He studied her from across the room. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, she focused on the piano's reflection in the window, where the rain outside merged with her silhouette. "Do you play?" he asked. She shook her head. "My mother did. I only listened." Dante's throat tightened at the mention of a mother. He wanted to ask more, but words came slowly, like rusted hinges. "You're not afraid of this place." "It's just a house, sir," she replied softly. "The lonely ones are usually people, not walls." Her words lingered long after she left that evening. He repeated them silently, as if tasting their truth. The lonely ones are usually people. That night he dreamed of music. The next morning she arrived earlier than usual. The storm had ended, leaving the air crisp and cool. She moved through the kitchen, preparing breakfast, unaware that he had canceled all other staff, that she was the only living presence besides him in this vast, sleeping mansion. When she carried the tray into the living room, Dante was already there, watching her reflection in the glass. "You don't have to bring it to me," he said quietly. "I can wait." "It's my job," she replied simply, setting the tray near him. Do you always follow rules? Only the ones that keep me safe. Am I dangerous? She looked up for the first time straight into his eyes. No, she said, but silence can be. He wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already moving toward the shelves, rearranging books that hadn't been touched since before the accident. Her efficiency fascinated him. Every motion was deliberate, economical, graceful. He found himself timing his breathing with her steps, as if her presence set the rhythm for the house. When she finished, she turned to him again. Would you like me to close the blinds? No, he said. Leave them open. I like the rain. She smiled faintly. You said that before. Did I? Yes, the first day I met you. Then I must have meant it. She nodded, that small gesture carrying more warmth than any conversation he had had in years. After she left, he wheeled himself through the empty halls, seeing the faint traces of her presence everywhere. The scent of lemon soap, the folded towels, the order she'd quietly imposed upon his chaos. For the first time, he realized how much he had let the mansion decay along with him. Over the next few weeks, Leia continued her work. Sometimes she stayed late when the rain grew heavier, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea while he lingered nearby, pretending to read. They rarely spoke, but when they did, their words mattered. He began to ask questions, not about her duties, but about her life. You used to be a nurse. Yes. Why stop? Because I couldn't save the only person who mattered. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. But that night, when thunder rumbled across the lake, he thought about her words. He understood the sound of failure too well. Leia didn't know much about Dante beyond what she could guess. The house was filled with old photographs, not of boardrooms and awards, but of men in dark coats standing in front of restaurants, clubs, warehouses. Groups of serious faces, arms around shoulders, the kind of pictures that spoke of loyalty and blood. She avoided looking at them, not out of disrespect, but because they felt like ghosts, too. One afternoon, she accidentally opened the wrong door. A study filled with old newspaper clippings, headlines about the crash, pictures of Dante standing beside another man, both younger, both smiling with the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. The articles mentioned investigations, whispered connections, families. She froze, realizing at once who he was. He saw the door open from across the hall. Their eyes met. For a long second, neither moved. Then he nodded slowly, giving her permission not to apologize. The next day, she still came back. That morning, as she cleaned the windows overlooking the lake, she said quietly, I read about what happened, the crash. Then you know why I don't speak much. You don't have to explain. People grieve differently. Is that what this is? Grief? It's silence with a heartbeat, she said. That's still living. He looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in the air between them. She didn't see a former power broker. He didn't see a maid. They saw two people surviving the same invisible ache. By the time she left that evening, he found himself listening for the sound of the door closing, hoping it wouldn't come. But it did, softly as always, like the end of a song. He rolled back to the window. The city lights shimmered in the distance. The reflection showed his face beside hers, faint and overlapping in the glass. The mansion that had been his cage was beginning to feel like something else, something fragile and alive. He didn't know it yet, but every silence she left behind was already being filled by something new. Days began to blend together, not in monotony, but in a rhythm that felt almost human again. Leia arrived every morning just before 8, her footsteps soft, her voice softer. The sound of her keys unlocking the door had become part of the house's heartbeat. For the first time in years, Dante felt time move not as a blur of empty hours, but as moments he could recognize. She worked methodically, cleaning each room with care, humming songs that carried both sorrow and comfort. They weren't songs he knew, but he began to wait for them. Sometimes she hummed near the piano, her melody drifting through the open hallways like smoke from a candle. It gave the mansion shape again, made the air less hollow. Dante would sit near the window, pretending to read, while his eyes followed her reflection on the glass. He noticed how she always looked at things as if they had meaning, the curtains, the photographs, even the dust. When she dusted the piano keys, she never wiped away fingerprints. She left the faint marks behind, as if honoring the traces of whoever had touched them last. "You always hum the same tune," he said one morning. She paused, startled but not afraid. "It's an old song," she answered. "My mother used to sing it when she thought I was asleep." "Does it have words?" "Yes," she said quietly, "but it's better without them." "Why?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his through the reflection. "Because words can lie. Humming can't." That answer stayed with him. He found himself thinking about it long after she had left for the day. Words can lie. He had spent his whole life surrounded by words. Promises, threats, negotiations. Maybe that was why he'd stopped speaking. By the second week, she had begun to leave small changes behind. Flowers near the window, a new towel folded differently, the scent of fresh coffee in the kitchen. She never asked permission. He never told her to stop. He didn't want her to think of him as a patient or a master. Somewhere in between those two truths, something fragile was forming. One morning while she cleaned the bookshelves, she found a framed photograph lying face down. When she lifted it, she saw Dante, younger, stronger, smiling beside another man. The other man had his arm around Dante's shoulder. Brothers, maybe not by blood, but by something deeper. She hesitated, then placed the photo upright again. When he noticed later, he didn't comment, but his throat ached for hours. It was raining again when she came to bring him tea. "You've stopped wearing headphones," she said, noticing the absence of the small devices that once blocked the outside world. "They made the silence too loud," he replied. "Silence is never loud," she said. "It's only heavy when there's something it wants to say." He looked at her, wondering how someone could speak like that. "You think silence wants to say something?" "Of course," she said. "Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to listen." That night he dreamed of her voice, not as words, but as warmth. The next morning the sunlight fell differently through the glass walls. He realized he had slept through the night for the first time in months. Slowly their exchanges became a ritual. She would speak in fragments. He would answer with pauses. "You used to be a nurse," he asked one afternoon. "Yes." "Why stop?" "Because I failed someone." "You couldn't have saved everyone." "That's what they told me," she said, "but they never met my mother." Dante didn't know how to comfort her, so he said nothing. Instead, he rolled closer to the piano, pressed one key gently, and said, "Then maybe you can help me save what's left of this." She smiled faintly. "The piano?" "Music," he said. That became the first time she laughed in his presence. A quiet, genuine, fine laugh that filled the room like sunlight through rain. From that day, their silence no longer felt like distance. It was a language they shared. In the evenings, when thunder rolled across the lake, she often stayed late. The housekeeper had stopped coming entirely, trusting Laya to lock up. Sometimes she found him in the study, staring at the old photo of him and his partner. She never asked questions. Instead, she'd wipe the dust off the frame and say softly, "He looks kind." "He was," Dante said once. "He believed in everything I forgot." "Maybe that's why you're still here," she whispered, "to remember." They never talked about the crash directly, but she could see it in his hands. The stiffness when he tried to move, the tremor when he reached for the teacup, the way he stared at the wheelchair as if it were a confession. He could see it in her too, the way she avoided hospitals when the news played in the background, the way she flinched when ambulances passed outside. Two wounded people, orbiting the same silence, waiting for one of them to breathe first. One rainy afternoon, he caught her standing by the window, staring at the lake. "What are you thinking?" And he asked. "How something so gray can still look alive," she said. "The lake?" "No," she said, glancing at him. "You." He didn't know how to answer. His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, his silence wasn't an escape. It was awe. Later that week, she stayed past midnight. The storm outside had cut the power, and the backup generator hummed softly. Candlelight flickered across the marble floors, painting the mansion in gold and shadow. She made tea by memory, her movements confident even in darkness. Dante watched her from across the room, his wheelchair positioned near the piano. "You should go home before it gets worse," he said. "The streets are flooded," she replied. "I'll wait until it calms down." "You don't have to stay." Neither do you, she said with a small smile. The simplicity of her answer disarmed him. He wanted to ask why she kept coming back, but instead he asked, do you ever get tired of cleaning up after other people? No, she said. Cleaning is just another kind of healing. You remove what hurts, you make room for light. He thought about that long after she fell silent. The house flickered between darkness and candlelight. Outside, the rain turned heavier, but inside, something quiet and fragile had begun to bloom. He realized he no longer watched her to fill time. He watched her because every movement reminded him he was still alive. The next morning, when the storm had passed, she opened the curtains and sunlight spilled into the room. Look, she said, pointing to the lake. The water looks new. He followed her gaze. The lake shimmered like glass reborn. He hadn't noticed before how beautiful it was after rain. It's strange, he murmured. Everything looks the same but different. That's what happens when you start paying attention again, she said. Dante turned toward her. Do you believe people can start over? She met his eyes steadily. I think they already do. Every morning they wake up. For the first time since the crash, he smiled without effort. The quiet routine had become something sacred, something real. The mansion was no longer a tomb of his past, but the beginning of something neither of them dared name. The storm returned without warning. It rolled across Lake Union like a living thing, shoving walls of water against the glass. Thunder shook the mansion, and lightning cracked open the night sky in blinding white. Laya was in the kitchen finishing up for the evening when the first power flicker came through. The lights dimmed, flared, and then died. Silence followed, thick, electric, alive. Mr. Moretti, she called softly into the darkness. No answer. The emergency lights should have come on, but they didn't. She reached for the drawer where she'd seen a box of candles earlier that week, her fingers brushing through shadows until she found them. She lit one, shielding the flame with her palm. The golden light trembled across her face as she stepped into the hallway. The house had changed. Every corner now felt deeper, every reflection heavier. She found him in the study by the window, motionless, eyes wide and glassy. The faint reflection of lightning streaked across his face. He was gripping the arms of his wheelchair, chest rising too quickly, breath shallow. Mr. Moretti, she said softly, dropping the formality for the first time. Dante. His head jerked toward her voice, but didn't seem to see her. She moved closer, keeping her voice calm. It's just the storm. The lights will come back. He didn't respond. His breathing grew ragged, body trembling. The candlelight quivered. Dante, can you hear me? His hands were white-knuckled, his lips moving soundlessly. She realized what was happening. Panic attack. She'd seen it before in patients who woke screaming after surgery. But this was worse. He wasn't just panicking. He was trapped inside his own body. Dante, she said again, kneeling beside him, placing a hand lightly on his arm. You're safe, you're home, just breathe with me. His eyes flicked to her hand, then to her face, unfocused. Lightning flashed behind them, the sound exploding seconds later. His whole body jolted. The candle flickered dangerously close to dying. His voice came out suddenly, rough and broken. I need to make love. Leia froze, not because of the words, but because of the tone. It wasn't desire, it was desperation. His voice cracked in half on the word love, as though he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He gasped again, tears streaming down his temples. Don't move, he whispered hoarsely. Please don't move. She didn't. She stayed still, holding her breath, her hand still resting against his arm. It was the same voice she'd heard the first day, the same trembling command. But now it wasn't a command at all. It was a plea. She looked into his face and saw a man unraveling, someone who had spent years holding himself together with silence, now breaking open because someone had finally stayed. Dante, she whispered, you don't need to make love. His eyes opened wider, the candlelight catching the tears on his cheeks. She squeezed his arm gently. You just need to be loved. The wind howled outside. The rain slammed against the glass as if the whole world had come to witness their confession. For a long moment, neither moved. She could feel his heartbeat under her hand, wild and uneven. Slowly, his breathing began to match hers. Inhale, Exhale, a rhythm borrowed from her calm. He whispered again, voice smaller now. It's been so long since someone touched me. Then remember this, she said softly. You're not alone right now. She set the candle down on the table and took his hand in both of hers. His fingers trembled under her touch, rough and cold. She held them anyway. The silence between them deepened into something fragile but whole, like a thread connecting two people who had both forgotten how to feel safe. Why did you stay? He asked after a long moment, voice breaking. Everyone else leaves. Because you asked me not to move, she said simply, and because I knew you didn't mean what you said. What did I mean? That you needed someone to see you. The wind rattled the windows again, but the fear was fading. His shoulders relaxed, the tension slowly uncoiling. She took a tissue from the table and gently wiped the tears from his face. The gesture was instinctive, almost maternal. I'm sorry, he murmured. Don't be. You shouldn't have to see me like this. And yet, here I am, she said softly. The generator clicked on suddenly, flooding the house with low amber light. Both of them blinked against it. Dante exhaled shakily, glancing down at their joined hands. You should go home, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Do you want me to? He hesitated. No, Ben. She smiled faintly. Then I'll stay until the storm ends. She poured tea by candle light, her movements steady, purposeful. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and rain. Dante drank slowly, the tremor in his hands lessening with each sip. I used to think silence was peace, he said after a while. Now it feels like drowning. Silence only heals when it's shared, she replied. Otherwise it eats you alive. He studied her face. The reflection of the candle made her eyes shine like amber. You talk like you've been there. I have, she said quietly. I watched someone die because I couldn't save her. After that, I stopped talking too. I thought if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, maybe the world would forget my mistake. It doesn't, he said. No, she agreed, but sometimes it forgives. Another crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Neither flinched this time. The worst had already passed. They sat together in silence. The kind that didn't hurt. The kind that made room for breathing again. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Minutes melted into hours. When the storm finally began to fade, she rose to blow out the candle. The smoke curled upward, twisting in the air like a final sigh. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not leaving when I made it impossible to stay. You didn't make it impossible, she said. You made it honest. As she gathered her things to go, he spoke again. Laya, she turned. Yes? If I forget how to speak again tomorrow, will you still talk to me like this? She smiled faintly, her eyes warm but sad. I don't need you to speak, Dante. I just need you to listen. She walked to the door, her steps slow, reluctant. He watched her shadow move down the hall, then disappear. For a long time after she left, he sat there listening to the rain. The candle had gone out, but the air still smelled of warmth. He whispered into the quiet, testing the sound of her name. Laya. The word was soft, fragile, but it didn't break. It drifted through the house like a promise. Outside, the storm ended. Inside, something had changed forever. Morning arrived gently, as if the world itself was afraid to make noise. The sky was pale and washed clean, the rain clouds scattered into ribbons of silver light over Lake Union. The mansion that had trembled through the night now rested in quiet surrender. The air smelled of wet cedar, electricity, and something faintly sweet, like renewal. Leia woke on the couch in the sitting room, the faint hum of the generator still echoing somewhere behind the walls. She had meant to leave after the storm passed, but exhaustion had caught her halfway through folding blankets. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair loose around her face. The teacup on the table had gone cold. When she opened her eyes, Dante was already awake. He sat by the piano, wheels locked, facing the morning light. He looked peaceful in a way she hadn't seen before. There was no tension in his jaw, no weight behind his eyes. The storm had stripped something from him, but what remained seemed more human. You stayed, he said quietly. His voice was soft, almost disbelieving. You fell asleep, she replied. I didn't want to wake you. He nodded slowly. It's been years since I slept through the night. You must have needed it. I think I needed something else. His gaze drifted toward her, steady and gentle. She looked away, pretending to adjust the pillow behind her. The sunlight caught her hair, turning it gold at the edges. Do you remember what you said? He asked. About what? About love? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. No one's ever said that to me before, he murmured. Not like that. Maybe they didn't know what you needed to hear. And you do? I didn't, until last night. The words hung between them, delicate as the morning light. Neither moved. The mansion seemed to listen. Finally, Leia stood and walked toward the kitchen. You should eat something. You're leaving. I'm making breakfast, she said without turning. That's not what I meant. Her hands stilled on the counter. Dante, last night was... She exhaled, searching for a word that didn't sound wrong. It was human, and that's why it can't happen again. Nothing happened, he said softly. Something did, she whispered. You started to feel again. He looked down at his hands, the faint tremor returning. And that scares you. It scares both of us, she said, placing the pan on the stove. The smell of butter filled the air, grounding them. You're lonely, and I understand loneliness. But I can't be the reason you wake up. You already are. She closed her eyes, the sound of the spatula scraping the pan, breaking the silence. That's not fair. I didn't mean for it to happen. Neither did I, she said softly. But it did. They ate in silence, the clink of utensils the only sound. When she finished, she washed her plate and dried her hands, her movements deliberate, precise. He watched her, afraid to speak again. There was a kind of finality in the way she moved, like someone preparing to disappear. The storm's over, she said quietly. I should go home. He opened his mouth, but no words came. She placed her folded apron on the table beside the candle stub from the night before. It still smelled faintly of smoke. Laia, he said finally, his voice trembling. Please don't go like this. She turned to him, eyes filled with something deeper than sadness. Resolve. Dante, I came here to clean your house, not to heal your soul. But you did both, and that's why I have to leave. Because of me? Because of what you make me feel, she said. Because I can't be your reason to live when I'm still figuring out how to live myself. He swallowed hard, his gaze falling to his lap. You think you saved me? No, she whispered. You saved yourself the moment you spoke. The wind stirred faintly through the open window. She stepped closer and placed something on the piano, a folded napkin with handwriting across the edge. For when it's too quiet again. He stared at it but didn't touch it. What does it say? You'll find out when you need to. She turned to leave, but his voice, raw, broken, called her name one last time. Laia. She stopped, her hand on the doorframe. Yes? If I promise not to ask you to stay, will you promise not to disappear? She hesitated, her throat tightening. I can't promise that. Then promise you'll remember me when it rains. She looked back at him, eyes glistening. Already do. And then she was gone. The door closed softly, almost kindly, leaving behind the faint trace of her perfume and the echo of her footsteps fading down the marble hall. Dante sat in the quiet for a long time. The sun climbed higher, warming the glass walls until the lake outside shimmered like molten gold. He looked at the napkin on the piano, at the small handwriting curving across the fabric. Finally, he unfolded it. In soft, uneven ink, it read, You don't need to say anything, just don't give up. His hand trembled as he held it. The words blurred through the tears. He didn't try to stop them. He wheeled himself to the piano and pressed one key. The note hung in the air, thin, wavering, imperfect. But it was sound, real sound. He pressed another, then another. His fingers were stiff, but the melody began to form, uncertain and fragile, like the first breath after drowning. He closed his eyes and played until the room filled with light. The music wasn't beautiful. It was something else, something raw and alive, like forgiveness finding its way home. By afternoon, the uniform she'd left behind was still folded neatly on the chair. The teacup was still half full, and the candle still stood where she'd placed it. The mansion felt emptier, but not dead. For the first time since the crash, the silence didn't suffocate him. It simply waited. Dante let the last note fade, then whispered into the air. You were right. His voice cracked, but he didn't care. I don't need to make love. I just need to remember how to love. Outside, the sky cleared completely. The rain had stopped, but the reflection on the lake still shimmered like liquid memory. Somewhere far away, he imagined her walking under the same sky, and he hoped she could feel it too, the moment the silence finally learned how to breathe. Weeks passed, marked not by time, but by silence. The house settled back into stillness, but something essential had changed. The quiet no longer felt cruel. It felt patient. The rain still came and went, tracing lines across the glass walls. Yet each droplet reminded Dante of her voice. Leia's absence lingered like the aftertaste of warmth, a presence woven into every corner she once touched. The folded napkin remained on his desk. The words, now faint from how many times he had unfolded and read them, "You don't need to say anything, just don't give up." It had become his scripture. Every morning he touched the edge of the fabric before rolling toward the window. He started noticing things he hadn't before. The sound of birds returning after rain, the hum of boats passing on Lake Union, the soft crack of the fireplace when the house grew cold. The world was still speaking. He had simply stopped listening. One quiet Tuesday, a letter arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting unfamiliar at first glance, neat, small, almost hesitant. His butler left it on the breakfast tray beside his tea. Dante didn't open it immediately. It had been years since he'd received anything handwritten. Everything about it felt too personal, too alive. He stared at the name in the corner, Leia Hart. His chest tightened. The tea went cold. When he finally gathered the courage to unfold it, the paper trembled in his hands. The ink was faded slightly, as if written in low light. Dear Mr. Moretti, I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. I didn't know how to explain what that night meant without making it sound like pity. It wasn't pity. It was the first time in years I saw someone fight to feel again. You didn't need me to save you. You just needed someone to stay long enough for you to remember you're still human. He stopped reading. His eyes blurred, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He pressed the letter to his chest as if to slow his racing heart. I've started working at a small nursing home just outside of Tacoma. It's quiet here, but in a way that doesn't hurt. Most of the patients can't speak, but I think of you when I hold their hands. You taught me that silence can be its own language, if someone's willing to listen. I hum while I work, the same song my mother used to sing. The nurses tease me about it, but some of the patients smile when they hear it. Maybe that's enough. Dante closed his eyes. He could almost hear her voice again, that soft tune echoing through the empty halls. The memory of it filled the room like sunlight. I hope you're well. I hope you've forgiven yourself. And if you ever play the piano again, I'll know you've found peace. The letter ended there, signed simply, with kindness, Laia. He reread it 3 times, each word cutting deeper and healing at once. Then with trembling hands, he rolled toward the piano. It waited in the same place by the window, silent but patient. Dust had settled across the keys again. He brushed it away carefully, his fingers pale and uncertain. For a long while he just stared at the ivory, afraid to begin. Then he pressed a single note. The sound filled the room, soft, imperfect, alive. He pressed another and another until the melody emerged, the one she had always hummed, the one he did not know he'd memorized. It was rough at first, uneven like breath after weeping, but soon it began to steady. The glass walls shimmered with the reflection of rain. His body trembled with effort, yet his heart felt weightless. The housekeeper, hearing the faint music from downstairs, froze mid-step. She hadn't heard the piano in years. She whispered a prayer under her breath and left him alone with his resurrection. As he played, Dante realized the letter had done something extraordinary. It gave him permission to live again. Not to be fixed, not to be whole, but to try. Every note he struck was a conversation with her absence. He began writing back that night. His handwriting was clumsy from disuse, the pen heavy in his weakened hand. Dear Leia, your letter arrived on a morning I had forgotten how to begin. You say silence can be a language. I think I'm finally learning its grammar. I played today. Not well, but honestly. And for the first time, the sound didn't frighten. I don't know if forgiveness ever fully arrives, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe we just learn to live with what we can undo. I hope you keep humming. You were right. It's better without words. D. He sealed the letter and set it on his desk, unsure if he would send it. It didn't matter. Writing it was enough. It meant his voice still existed, even if the world never heard it again. The next few days brought rain again. He welcomed it. He kept the windows open, letting the smell of the storm fill the halls. Sometimes he imagined her walking through the nursing home's quiet corridors, humming to those who could no longer speak. The thought comforted him. At night, he left the candle burning near the piano, the same one she'd lit during the storm. Its flame flickered against the glass, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he saw her reflection there. Her hands moving, her eyes warm, the faint curve of a smile. Weeks turned to months, and the letter became his anchor. Every time loneliness crept too close, he touched the paper and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if she'd ever write again, but she had already given him the only answer he needed. On a quiet morning near spring, the gardener found him in the music room, still by the window. The piano was silent, the letter lying open beside him. His eyes were closed, but his face looked peaceful. So peaceful it seemed impossible he had ever known despair. The nurse later said he must have fallen asleep listening to the rain. But that night, when the staff locked up, someone swore they heard the faint sound of a piano coming from the upper floor. A slow melody, imperfect and gentle, like a heart learning how to speak again. The letter didn't stop haunting him. It lived in his pocket, creased and worn from being folded too often, its paper softened by the warmth of his hand. Each time he read it, something inside him stirred. A memory of touch, a fragment of courage, the faint hum of her song echoing through his mind. Months passed since her words first reached him. The mansion, once a shrine to solitude, now felt too large for his new quiet. He began physical therapy again. The doctor, a young woman with sharp eyes and a kind heart, stared at his determination as if it were a miracle. "Mr. Moretti, you're months ahead of recovery projections," she said one afternoon as he managed to move his legs a few inches with the aid of new neuromuscular braces. He smiled faintly, exhausted but alive. "Maybe I just needed a reason." "Or someone," the doctor replied softly. He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Each day after therapy, he rolled himself to the piano. It had become his heartbeat. He played for hours, even when his fingers cramped, until he could finally shape her song the way she hummed it, gentle, healing, unfinished. The mansion no longer felt haunted. It felt expectant, as though it too was waiting for something. One gray afternoon, he looked out over the lake and decided. He called the butler and asked him to prepare the adaptive car that had sat unused for years. "I'm driving," Dante said simply. The man hesitated. "Sir, are you certain? It's a long road." "Yes," Dante said, his tone calm but unwavering. "I've stayed still long enough." The next morning he left Seattle before dawn. The sky was the color of slate, and a fine mist clung to the pavement. The highway stretched endless ahead of him, wet asphalt, distant pine trees, mountains that rose like ghosts through the fog. His hands trembled slightly on the steering controls, but the freedom of movement, the wind rushing against the car windows, felt sacred. Every mile forward felt like reclaiming something time had stolen. Tacoma was quieter than he remembered. The nursing home sat at the edge of town, a low white building surrounded by oaks and lilacs. Children's chalk drawings covered the walkway near the entrance. He parked near the gate and stared for a moment, afraid to go inside. What if she'd moved on? What if she'd forgotten him? He almost turned around. Then a small voice inside whispered her words, "You don't need to say anything, just don't give up." He took a slow breath and rolled forward. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, lavender, and soup. A nurse glanced up from the front desk. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Dante hesitated. "I'm looking for Leah Hart." The nurse's face softened. "She's in the East Wing, room 104. But visiting hours don't start until—" "It's all right," came another voice. Leah was standing in the hallway behind the nurse, a clipboard in her hand, her hair tied back loosely. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The sounds, the air, the weight of time. Her eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with tears faster than she could blink them away. Dante, she whispered. He tried to speak, but his throat closed. The letter trembled in his lap, worn and folded. She rushed forward, stopping just short of touching him, afraid it was a dream that might vanish if she reached too fast. You came all this way. He nodded. I had to. You're the only person who ever heard me. Her breath caught, the room blurring behind her. You shouldn't have, she murmured, though her voice betrayed the opposite. It's a long drive. I wanted to hear the song again, he said, from the source. She laughed through her tears, a sound that made the hall feel smaller, warmer. You remember it? Every note, he said. She gestured toward the window at the end of the corridor. There's a bench outside by the garden. It's quieter there. They went together side by side, his wheelchair humming softly, her steps unhurried. The garden was simple, roses, ivy, a single maple tree, shedding red leaves onto the grass. A few elderly residents watched from their chairs, smiling faintly at the sight of them. When they reached the bench, she sat beside him, close enough that their reflections overlapped in the glass door behind them. The sky had cleared, pale sunlight falling through the branches. You look stronger, she said. I feel less broken. So the therapy worked. No, he said, turning toward her. You did. She smiled, shaking her head. You give me too much credit. And you give yourself too little. They sat in silence, watching the wind stir the leaves. After a while, he took the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. I read this more times than I've breathed, he said. You said if I ever played again, you'd know I found peace, did you? I'm trying, he said. It's messy, imperfect, but it's real. She unfolded the letter gently, eyes soft with memory. I wasn't sure you'd ever read it. I didn't just read it, he said. I lived it. She reached out and took his hand, her touch steady and familiar. You came all this way to tell me that? No, he whispered. I came because I didn't want to spend another day wondering what your voice sounded like in person again. The words were simple, but they held years of silence behind them. Laya blinked back tears. You shouldn't say things like that, she said softly. Why not? Because I'll believe you. Then believe me. A single tear rolled down her cheek. He lifted his trembling hand and brushed it away with the back of his finger. You told me silence can heal, he said, but I think love finishes the work. She smiled then, through tears, her thumb resting lightly over his hand. You always had a way with words, even when you didn't use them. They stayed there until the sun began to set, the light dipping into amber over the garden. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Every unspoken thought between them had already been written in rain, in piano notes, in the letters they carried in their hearts. As evening settled, she whispered, You should come back tomorrow. The patients love music. Then I'll bring the only thing I have left to give, he said. What's that? The sound of being seen. And when she laughed, a soft, trembling sound, it felt like the world had exhaled. The silence between them wasn't lonely anymore. It was full. The seasons shifted softly around them. What began as a single visit became a rhythm of returning. Dante drove to the nursing home every weekend, rain or shine, until the staff stopped treating him as a visitor and started greeting him like family. He played the piano in the lobby while the residents listened from their wheelchairs, their eyes closing as if the music took them somewhere kinder. And always, Leia sat nearby, humming quietly, her voice weaving between his notes like a memory reborn. Over time, Dante's health began to fade. His doctors called it fatigue, a natural decline after years of immobility. But he recognized it for what it was, his body catching up with the years he'd spent waiting to live. He didn't tell Leia at first. She had rebuilt too much of him to burden her with the truth. But she saw the signs anyway. The way he paused longer between breaths, the way his hands trembled after every song. The moments when his gaze lingered on her face a little too long, as if memorizing her. One late afternoon, as gold light stretched across the nursing home garden, she found him sitting outside, staring at the small pond that reflected the sky. The air smelled faintly of lilac and autumn. You're quiet today, she said. I'm saving my strength, he answered, his smile soft but tired. For what? For the last sunset I want to see. Her heart stopped. Don't say things like that. I don't mean it as an ending, he said. Just a way of being grateful before I go. She sat beside him, her eyes wet. You're not going anywhere. Everyone goes somewhere, he said gently. I just want to choose the view. Silence fell between them. A few leaves drifted down from the maple tree, catching the light as they fell. She reached for his hand, clutching it tightly. You've built a life again, Dante. The foundation, the music, the patience you play for. Don't talk as if it's over. It's not over, he said, squeezing her fingers. It's finally beginning to make sense. That night, she insisted he stay in the spare cottage near the pond instead of driving back to Seattle. The staff helped prepare it, a small single-story home with wide doors and soft light that smelled of wood and warmth. Dante moved in with quiet gratitude, calling it the house that kindness built. Days passed in peace. Laya visited each morning before her shifts, bringing coffee and flowers from the garden. They talked about everything and nothing. Her mother, his empire, the shape of clouds, the way the rain always sounded like applause on the roof. He smiled more than he spoke. She laughed more than she cried. And together they learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the softness of each shared silence. One evening she arrived to find him by the window, a notebook open on his lap. What are you writing? She asked, leaning closer. Not writing, he said, remembering. She saw the first few words scrolled across the page. For Leia, who taught me that silence isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of love. Her throat tightened. You shouldn't waste your strength on this. It's not wasted, he said. It's being spent exactly where it belongs. He looked up then, his gaze steady, filled with the quiet conviction of a man who had already made peace. Leia, when I'm gone, promise me something. Don't, she said. Please, promise me you'll keep living, that you'll keep helping people who can't speak. Promise me you won't disappear into someone else's silence like I did. Tears fell freely down her cheeks. You gave me that strength, Dante. You don't have to ask me to keep it. Then we saved each other, he said softly. She knelt beside him, resting her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was slow, steady, fragile. I don't know how to let you go, she whispered. You don't have to, he murmured. Just carry what mattered. Outside, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, turning the pond into molten amber. The water shimmered with the reflection of clouds. He stretched his hands slowly, his fingers brushing hers. Look at it, he said. Every sunset is a rehearsal for heaven. She tried to smile through the tears. Then don't rush to the final act. He chuckled weakly. Maybe heaven waits for those who learn patience. As the light faded, the candle on the table beside them flickered. Its flame reflected in the glass, two small fires dancing side by side, one stronger, one weakening. Leia felt him tremble and pressed her palm against his. You're here, she whispered. You're still here. Always, he said, in the music, in the rain, in every quiet room that someone refuses to leave. His eyes drifted toward the window again. Promise me you'll play for them when I can't. I will, she said, her voice breaking, but only if you promise to listen. I already am, he whispered. The last light of day touched his face, soft and golden. His hand loosened in hers. She stayed beside him long after the sun had gone, her tears falling soundlessly onto his arm. The candle burned lower, its flame shrinking to a whisper before finally surrendering. When the nurse arrived later that night, she found Leia sitting there in silence, holding his hand, her head bowed but calm. There was no sound but the soft breath of wind through the trees. By morning, the cottage was filled with light again. The pond shimmered beneath a pale blue sky. Dante's chair was empty by the window, but the piano inside the nursing home began to play. Soft, trembling notes echoing through the halls. The staff swore it couldn't be real, that no one was there. But Leia knew. She played until her hands stopped shaking. Then she whispered, You made it. Outside, the world glowed gold, as if heaven itself had bent down to listen. 1 year later, spring returned to Lake Union. The world looked cleaner, softer, as if the rain itself had decided to start over. The glass mansion that once stood silent now belonged to something new. The Dante Moretti Foundation for Compassionate Care. The marble floors gleamed again, but this time with purpose. The rooms that had once held emptiness now carried the sound of laughter, conversation, and piano music echoing faintly from the atrium. Laya walked through the hallway holding a stack of folders against her chest. She wore simple clothes and a small silver pendant shaped like a teardrop, a gift from one of the patients. Her hair had grown longer, and though grief still lingered behind her smile, it was a quiet kind of grief, the kind that had learned to live beside hope. The foundation employed therapists, nurses, and volunteers, all dedicated to helping people who had lost their voices through trauma or illness. On the wall behind the reception desk hung a plaque carved in steel. For those who cannot speak, may you still be heard. Beneath the words was his name, in memory of Dante Moretti. Every morning sunlight spilled across that plaque, and every morning Leia stopped to touch it with her fingertips, whispering the same four words, "You kept your promise." She moved through the rooms, greeting staff and patients, pausing to listen when someone tried to say their first word again. She understood the patience it required, the trembling silence before speech, the courage it took to make sound after years of muteness. She never rushed anyone, Sham. She knew healing had its own rhythm. In the afternoon, she taught piano to patients who couldn't speak but could still feel. "You don't need to talk," she'd say. "Just play what you wish you could say." Some pressed the keys tentatively, others with surprising strength. Every note, every mistake was welcome. Music had become the foundation's second language. One rainy day in April, she unlocked the main hall for the weekly recital. The staff and families gathered, small candles flickering on each table. The piano stood where Dante had once played, its surface polished until it caught the reflection of every flame. Leia sat down on the bench, her fingers trembling lightly over the keys. "He used to say music was a way of forgiving the world," she told the room. "Tonight, we'll play to remember." The melody that followed was the one she hadn't played since that last sunset by the pond. It rose softly, carrying warmth through the air, as if each note built a bridge between the living and the gone. When she reached the final chord, she looked up, and for a moment she swore she saw him in the reflection of the glass wall, his faint smile watching, his hand still. After the recital, she stepped outside. The rain was falling lightly, steady as breath. She stood beneath the overhang, feeling the mist on her face. In the distance, across the Wekawani Lake, the lights of the city shimmered. Somewhere between them and her, she imagined his voice again, the way it sounded that night in the dark. "Don't move," she whispered into the rain, smiling through tears. "I'm not going anywhere." Later that evening, she sat by the piano alone, lighting a single candle. Its flame flickered against the wall, casting shadows that danced like echoes of memory. Beside the candle rested a framed photograph, Dante sitting by the window, his eyes full of peace. Underneath, engraved in silver, were the words, "Love doesn't ask for permission. It finds two souls, binds them, and teaches them to speak even in silence." She reached into the drawer and pulled out the napkin he'd kept all those years ago. The ink was faded now, but the message still clear. "You don't need to paint anything, just don't give up." She placed it beside the photograph and smiled. "You never did," she said softly. The candle burned lower, and she closed her eyes. The soft hum of rain blended with her breathing. She began to hum the tune, the same one her mother once sang, the same one that had tied her to Dante across storms and silence. As her voice filled the room, the piano seemed to answer back, each vibration resonating through the wood, through the air, through memory itself. When she finished, she whispered, "Good night, Dante." Then she blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, twisting gently before fading into the dark. Outside, dawn began to break through the clouds. The lake shimmered, alive with light. And for those who listened closely, somewhere between the rain and the wind, there was the faint sound of a piano, soft, imperfect, eternal, carrying a promise that love, once spoken, never truly goes silent.